When you think of racial segregation, what comes to mind? Is it the Brown versus Board of Education, 1954 Supreme Court decision? Or is it things like housing, healthcare, public accommodations? I thought a lot about these issues, especially growing up in San Francisco in the projects. However, the one area that I hadn't thought about was strip clubs. That is until I started working at one. In this talk, I'm going to discuss how my experience at the Lusty Lady Theater shaped my understanding of race and racial segregation as a sociologist in the fields of African American studies and gender studies. So, as I mentioned, I grew up in San Francisco, and I grew up in the housing projects. And this is significant because most people are not aware of the racial segregation in the city. My mom lived in the projects partly because of her mental illness and partly because of San Francisco's racist housing policies. So I spent a good part of my life growing up not really even being exposed to the larger area of the city. And this really had an effect on me. I also grew up in a non-working environment, and there were several advantages to that. Actually, I wasn't socialized for a 9-to-5 job, so therefore I had a lot of freedom to figure out what is it that I might want to do with my life. After reading, for instance, Alice Walker's The Color Purple, I thought, well, maybe I'll be a writer. Other times I thought, after getting introduced to Naomi Campbell on the cover of Vogue magazine, I thought, well, maybe I'll be a model. I mean, the possibilities of what I thought I was going to do with my life were endless. The only thing I wasn't sure about was, what college am I going to? See, I didn't know a lot of people who attended college, and I thought I was going to go to community college like so many of my friends. A program out of San Francisco State, however, called Step to College, totally changed my path. It was a program geared towards children, high school students, particularly in their junior year. And the intent was, if one passes with a B or higher, you could get into any CSU without taking the SAT. I loved this idea because I was not a great test taker. So I'm proud to say that I got an A in the class and I was automatically admitted into San Francisco State University. And when I was there, I loved it. I loved it. I learned so many things. I majored in women's studies, I took ethnic studies courses, and I was really involved with the social movements of the time. One being the Rodney King riots that happened just as I got to campus. It was scary and it was also exciting. Other things that happened were debates about race and gender. And I remember writing for the school newspaper against the verdict of O.J. Simpson. I supported Anita Hill when she accused Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment at a time where we did not have a Me Too movement. And I just felt myself coming alive. I was also introduced, believe it or not, through my women's studies courses. I was introduced to the sex industry, and I realized that some women were actually working in various aspects of the sex industry to supplement their income. I had never heard of this before. One theater that was really popular in San Francisco was the Lusty Lady Theater. It was a theater that was known in feminist circles for being women-owned, and it was very famous to the point where it was a tourist attraction. And there were several women working there at the time. I asked one of my friends what it was like there because I was having, like many of us, financial difficulties. And she told me I should apply and I should audition and just give it a shot. And I did. I got an audition with the Black show director at the time, Josephine, and I auditioned to a 3-minute song on stage. And to my surprise and delight, I was hired. However, I was hired on the condition that I cover my navel ring with a scarf because the club had a policy against body piercings and tattoos. Little did I know that this audition would totally change the path of my life. I worked at the Lusty Lady while I finished my junior year of college, and I loved it. I loved the performances. I loved putting on makeup. And I just thought it was so empowering, but not everyone saw this as a good thing. For instance, a friend of mine from high school accused me of selling out to the patriarchy, making Black women look bad, which was not my intent at all. My mother, of course, was horrified, and she couldn't even understand or fathom how I could work there. And then I had people I knew in college who felt that after I graduated, I should get a quote unquote real job. I shouldn't be working there anymore. And it was very discouraging. The disapproval also came from strangers, people I would meet at parties who, once they found out I worked at the theater, wondered how I could degrade myself. And so after a while, I just stopped talking about work, or I lied and said I did something else. At work, things were not as smooth as I thought they were either. There was racial segregation I slowly learned over time at the theater. So for instance, out of 70 dancers, only 3 were Black and 1 was dark-skinned. The other thing that I noticed was that in what was called the private pleasures booth, which some of you may know as a VIP room or a champagne room, it was a place where women could make their most money. So you could make $60 an hour, which is different from just dancing on stage. And I noticed Black women were never scheduled. And so I asked Josephine, why aren't there Black women scheduled here? And she said, well, it's not our fault. Black women just don't make the money. White men do not want to see Black women for $60 when they could see them for 25 cents, which is what it took to operate the Lusty Lady because it was a peep show. Prior to that, I thought anybody could walk in and, get a job at a glamorous strip club or gentleman's club. But I could not have been more wrong about this. So in response, I created a petition challenging this policy and stating that Black women should work in the private pleasures booth. Other dancers signed it, and from that, we learned there were other problems at the theater too. For instance, customers would videotape dancers without their consent in what was called one-way windows, meaning that a customer could see a dancer, but a dancer would only see her own reflection. And remember, this is the eve of the internet, so people were concerned about these images showing up online or outing them as having worked at the theater. And it was a lot of discrimination against dancers at this time. So I created this petition, and I was reprimanded by the show directors, and they wanted to know, why didn't I just come to them about the problem, even though I did? But they did decide to schedule Black women in the private pleasures booth and remove the one-way windows. But we knew we needed a permanent solution. So we decided to organize with SEIU Local 790, and we got together and we went to meetings, and we became the first successful strip club in the United States to unionize. Very proud of this work. As we were organizing other clubs, I noticed that there were there were a lot of patterns that I didn't know before. So for instance, I noticed that a lot of Black women worked at clubs where it was very seedy, felt unsafe, unlit neighborhoods, heavy police presence, and also the presence of stage fees. Stage fees are basically a rent that dancers pay to justify working at this space. So it's almost as if they're performers and they're paying to like rent the space. And owners do this to get out of paying things like health insurance, sick leave, Social Security. So I noticed that a lot of Black women worked at clubs with these stage fees. And basically what I noticed was that the surrounding areas of clubs mirrored a lot of neighborhoods that Black people lived in, fast food places, check cashing places instead of banks. This is what sociologists call disinvestment. Disinvestment is when one community gets more resources over the other. So for instance, in schools where there are a lot of people of color, they get less resources and they have a lower tax base than, say, schools in a white suburban environment. This was the same in the sex industry. I also discovered not just the sex industry, but the overall, all of it, like pornography, prostitution. So for instance, Black women tend to work outdoors versus indoor when it comes to prostitution. I didn't know this or even think about this before. They have less access to escort agencies, didn't know that. Gentlemen's clubs, like the one that was featured in Hustlers, they don't hire Black women. Or if they do, Black women have the least lucrative shifts. Most Black women work at places where there's high levels of violence, including sexual harassment and low pay. And this is actually true even in places in the South where rappers tend to use a lot of strip clubs, for their background to these videos, but that doesn't necessarily help Black women. Now, some people might feel like, well, what are they complaining about? They're in the sex industry. But that does not mean that they should be sexually harassed. So the sociological term for this would be hypersexualization, meaning that Black women are seen as more available for sex. Now, again, some people might say, well, isn't this a good thing, right? Because they're in the sex industry. And what I would argue is no, it actually is why they are working at clubs with high levels of violence and sexual harassment and stage fees, and that this version of hypersexualization doesn't just affect Black women in the sex industry, but also in other jobs where they are subject to low pay and also lack of proper health care and violence on the job. However, Black strippers are fighting back, and we see this in places such as New York, Oregon, and Philadelphia. So in New York, for instance, a lot of the Black dancers are fighting against being pitted against the cocktail waitresses who tend to be lighter and they are making more than the strippers. So there are many ways in which dancers are organizing that the Lusty Lady actually spearheaded back in the 90s. When I was 27, after 5 years of working as a dancer and a union organizer, I decided it was time for a career change. I had written so many articles and journals about the Lusty Lady and the unionization. I even interviewed Angela Davis for the UC Hastings Law Journal. With the help of Black feminist social scientists, I was able to apply and get accepted into the New School for Social Research in Sociology. Working at the Lusty Lady has taught me to see race differently. And in my current role as a professor and a sociologist, this is what I help my students to do, see race differently, even if it is under the strobe lights and the sex appeal of a strip club. Thank you.